But as was announced today, today we're going to be starting with kind of a it's still within our culture unit, but it's very much a differentiation from what we've been doing for the last, I would say, 2 weeks. We've been covering more of the visual arts, whether it be poetry, other forms of literature, or arts or art forms that we hear, specifically music, especially earlier American musical styles. What we're doing now, well, architecture in itself is a visual art in its own form, but in other ways, architecture is also an expression of not just an art within itself, but it is a science and or trade in some formats or ways. So really, when we cover architecture, when we cover architects, we have to kind of one well, to start off, as you may or may not know from just the title of this week's module, the what we're covering, or the style of architecture that we're covering in this course specifically, is mid-century modern. And we'll talk about the significance of mid-century modern architecture, which is a style of American, well, not really a style of American architecture, because the mid-century modern style not only is very famous specifically in America, but has its own different variations throughout the world as well. But it was a very famous style throughout America from really the late 40s all the way up to the early 80s in some cases, but really the golden years of mid-century modern are really the 50s to the 70s. And we'll talk about what that style looks like, because you may be familiar with the name of the style, but we'll talk about what the style looks like. What are the how should we say, the signature architectural designs of that style, how it relates to Black history, because it does, and actually many of the pioneers of what is known as America's really standout style, and this is why we have to talk about other architectural styles, really come from Black American communities, and specifically on the East Coast and the Midwest. Really, a lot of these very famous Black architects who are really in the mid-century modern scene come out of specifically Chicago and Washington, D.C., but there are also some very really significant artists who do a lot of their work in Los Angeles. We'll really be talking about one specific LA-based architect as we go on further into this module today. But, excuse me, as we really want to, how should I say exactly, as we kind of discover more and more about architecture, and we have to talk about how and why there's this connection between the Black American culture and mid-century modern architecture, we have to talk about a brief history or a brief rundown of architecture in America before we meet mid-century modern architecture. Because mid-century modern architecture, as I stated before, takes place between really the 50s to the 70s. And this is not 1850, this is not 1750, this is 1950 through 1970s. This is a post-war architectural style. This is in response to not only the need for more homes after World War II, after the United States becomes more and more financially successful, but also it's a response to the growing, or to the proliferation of what we now know as the suburb, which is basically a community outside of a large urban center or a city that is usually more spread out, that is more car-centric, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk about how that really ties into architecture, and how that really ties into the history of of how mid-century modern architecture really is grounded in a lot of Black architects as well. But before we talk about the style of mid-century modern architecture, we have to talk about the common styles that you would see in the United States. Now, I'm not going to go over every single architectural style, but I'm going to go over the styles that you are more likely to see, especially if you are still living in the city of Redlands. A little personal note about myself. As some of you may or may not know, I recently moved out of Redlands and am taking a quick sojourn in Las Vegas, Nevada. However, I've gotten good news in which I will be moving to Denver, Colorado in a few short, in 2 short months, actually. So not only am I going from California to Nevada, but now I'm going from Nevada to Denver as well. But besides that, the reason why I talk about Redlands is because Redlands is actually a good representation of almost every single American architectural style. You have anything from Queen Anne Victorians, from Spanish colonials, to even mid-century modern architecture, to what we would call contemporary architecture. Which contemporary architecture really isn't a specific. Well, how should I say this? Contemporary architecture not really is a specific style, but is more reminiscent of the time or reminiscent of the current time. So contemporary architecture looks very different depending on the country it is in. However, contemporary architecture, as you'll see, there's kind of a subsection of what we call global contemporary, in which is a more common architectural style no matter the country you go to. So it's not really drawing from a specific country, but drawing from a very specific style of architecture, if anything. But if we really kind of go more into it, um, so what we really see in Redlands also throughout the United States, we see a couple different styles. So most of our styles are what we call colonial styles. So colonial styles are styles that are based off of the architecture and or the architectures of either the descendants of European settlers from the Americas, or basically the or basically the settlers or descendants of European settlers coming to America, and how they adjust their architectural styles to America and the specific materials that are available in America. So a lot of these styles are, for example, all these you would see in Redlands also throughout the United States. So these are your Dutch colonials, which have Dutch colonials are most famous in the Northeast region. So think of Maine, those kind of buildings, those Cape Cod style cottages, those kind of things. Very popular with a lot of shingle work, very specific and very unique gable roof styles. But that's what we really see from Dutch colonials. We also see English colonials, or what we call in some ways what is typically called normal colonial style. The English really influence American architecture through a couple different styles, whether it be English colonials, the arts and crafts style, which is heavily based off of also Tudor buildings in England as well. And then we also see from other groups within the United States, Germany also influenced German immigrants with the Tudor style as well, because there is a similarity between German Tudor buildings and the English Tudor buildings as well. We also see a lot of French colonial buildings, specifically in New Orleans, and also some areas that have been areas that have been influenced by the French as well, but mainly in New Orleans. But we also see that in the South as well. We also see the neoclassical style, which the neoclassical style, even though it's heavily influenced by English, but also Roman traditions of architecture and also Greek traditions of architecture, is really known as the first American unique style. So neoclassical is really, if you've ever seen Thomas Jefferson's house, that's an example of neoclassical architecture, but also the White House is an example of neoclassical architecture. So that's also kind of, well, neoclassical / federal architecture, as we call it. But it's really an example of what was originally seen as, American quote-unquote architecture. But we also see Spanish colonial, which is also very popular in Redlands, which is, the Spanish colonial is a very interesting style because there is Spanish revival, there's Spanish colonial, and then there's Spanish, there's also another style of Spanish colonial homes, which are very much mixed within the indigenous population and the indigenous ways of building. So I would say the more eastern you get is a more quote unquote traditional Spanish colonial type of build, which to kind of characterize them without showing you a photo, these are typically buildings 1-story or 2-story, which typically use stucco, available timber, usually red tiles, things like that, with low-pitched gable roofs, as well as some hipped roofs as well. Usually have quite an overhang, and things like that. Those are what really characterizes those styles of buildings. But as you move further west, especially as you move to places such as New Mexico, California, of course, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, you see styles that are more influenced by the Pueblo, or even in Colorado, the Pueblo style of building that was really popular, specifically in Pueblo, Colorado, as well. So you really see that the Spanish colonial style, the further west it goes, is more and more influenced by the indigenous groups of that area. And it's very similar with Redlands, California as well when it comes to the building. You see more of an influence of indigenous groups and indigenous architecture into the Spanish colonial style that we see in Redlands as well. And then the other styles that we see, which is also reminiscent of the English, is also the Queen Anne Victorian style, or other Victorian styles. So when it comes to Victorian architecture, there's Queen Anne, First Empire, Second Empire, Italianate, which is slightly also based off of Italian architecture as well. And what we really see is these are all of these styles that I just listed, even though they come from different countries, they do share one thing in common, is that these are, in a way, very classically European styles of architecture. These are styles of architecture that draw really from European ideals. However, they also do draw a bit from, like I said, not only indigenous ideals, but also some African styles as well, and African traditions as well. The architectural tradition of a front porch was not really something very popular among the European architectural styles, because most European countries are cold and therefore you don't need a porch. A porch is really for hotter traditions and hotter areas. So when the South was colonized, or the American South was starting to be colonized and starting to be used for plantations, etc., that architectural style that actually originally came from originally came from Africa, of porches for hotter climates, was taken over, especially for plantations, etc. But what we really see, those styles that I was talking about, are mainly European influence. The difference with the mid-century modern style is, yes, there are definitely European influences for the mid-century modern architectural style, especially when it comes to the Danish and the Swedish, their impacts on mid-century modern architecture, especially furniture. But what we see is mid-century modern architecture is really inspired off of African culture, specifically continental African culture, and African American or Black American culture. Of course, like I said, there are European inspiration, and there are white American architects who are heavily involved. I'm pretty sure you're very familiar with, excuse me for a quick sec, with the works of Frank Gehry and other popular mid-century architects. But what we really see is that mid-century modern architecture is, yes, a somewhat of a continuation of some European traditions and styles, but it's an inclusion per se, or it's an adoption of what was typically seen as not really influencing current American architecture, being African and Black American architectural styles. And we'll talk about where we see that and how that works exactly. But the reason why, and let's go back to why mid-century modern architecture is established as a style, and why these styles really start to pop up. Because if you notice, in what we call mid-century modern architecture, it's a lot of different things. And I want to be very careful about the terminology I use with everything, of course. But there's a difference between the term mid-century in relation to architecture, and there's a difference between mid-century modern, because mid-century architecture encompasses mid-century modern, and it encompasses ranch-style homes. It encompasses a lot of different styles of home that could be unique to very specific places within the United States and abroad. However, mid-century modern is a very specific style that also encompasses the Googie style, which is very specific to California as well. So, to explain, mid-century architecture is a style of architecture, specifically in the United States, that starts to become popular as soon as the end of World War II in response to the need for additional housing and the need / proliferation of the suburb in America. The mid-century style, as opposed to more traditional European styles that were present in the United States, is usually a style that is either a one-story style or it's a split-level style, which split level is usually either two floors that are split into different height platforms. The mid-century style usually is, especially in the ranch style, is usually one floor. However, it can be more than one floor. And the mid-century style really is the use of specifically um, half gabled roofs, which is basically, if I were to explain, it's kind of a triangle style roof, but it's basically splitting it in half. Usually very low angled half styled roofs, in some cases flat roofs, the use of natural materials. So as opposed to European styles, which did use natural materials, but at the same time use materials that were, how should I say exactly, use materials that did not exactly blend in with the nature. The mid-century modern style was more likely to use the materials of the area, and were more likely to use specific stones instead of things like brick, etc. Um, this was also a very, how should I say, a very, I guess you would say, neutral to warm style of architecture, where it would use warm woods, very warm to neutral colored greens, browns, oranges, which you're very probably familiar with if you lived in the 70s and 80s. Um, and it's a style that very much is significantly different from the styles that really dominated the United States years before. And this is in part because a lot of these neighborhoods that were being built, a lot of these suburbs that were being built, were rapidly expanding and were rapidly transforming around um, previously built homes. So if you've ever been to Redlands, or if you live in Redlands, or you're familiar with how Redlands works, then Redlands is a very good example of this. Um, Redlands, there's a very specific area, specifically south of Redlands, that is, you see Victorian houses or older style houses, but also as you go more north, or as you go more, I believe, west, you start to see that kind of one story, very much low angled roof style, which are in many cases either mid century or ranch style homes. Because to be quite honest, especially in the case of the United States, Victorian styles, even Spanish colonial styles, those homes are very expensive and very painstakingly long to build. So mid-century modern builds, even though there is very much artistic craft that goes into mid-century buildings as well as mid-century modern buildings, these buildings were very, very inexpensive as compared to the previous Queen Anne style, colonial styles, and other European drawing styles. These mid-century builds, were much less expensive. So that made it much easier to expand these suburbs and build multiple homes at once, or build multiple homes for a flourishing neighborhood. And what we also saw is that a lot of these mid-century homes, specifically, were built for the use of a car. So if you have an older home, if you have something that was built usually before 1940, more than likely you do not have a garage that was original to the home, because even up to the 1940s, most people were not owners of cars. Into the 1950s, 60s, and especially 70s, it was more common not only for a family to own a car, but it was even more common for a family to own more than one car. So what we see is the mid-century modern style is also an adaptation to the increased car culture or car dependency that was happening with the United States. So really a good way to tell if you have to tell the difference between a Victorian house or mid-century house. If you're really not a person who has a keen eye for architectural choices, is, does the garage of that house look original to that house? And if it looks original or attached, more than likely it's a mid-century home. But that's really what the mid-century style was. It was an explosion of both the suburb, and it was an explosion of the use and proliferation of the car as well within society. And what we see is, we really see that the mid-century style in terms of not only the developing of just suburbs all over the United States, but we really see that the mid-century style starts to really increase and really starts to boom specifically in Chicago and Washington, D.C. And I say that because in Chicago, Washington, D.C. is where, especially after the Civil Rights Act, especially in the late 60s to early 70s, and even up to the all the way up to even the mid 90s, was this rise of the black middle class, especially in the Washington, D.C. to Virginia to Maryland area. We saw a large increase of the black middle class. We saw a large increase of black professionals as well. And the mid-century style was really also a response, especially from black architects, was really a response to the increased need for suburbs for black individuals who basically saw the city, especially after the Great Migration, which many people, whether they're themselves or even their parents, had immigrated from. What we really saw was there was no longer enough room for the larger families to live in cities or to live in apartments or to live in high rises. So what became more useful were the more sprawled out suburbs that we now see today. And actually, a fun fact, one of the first suburbs in California, well, actually one of the first suburbs in the entirety of the United States, was actually established in California. And that city specifically is what we now know as Lakewood, California. And if you know a bit about me, I actually grew up in the city right next to Lakewood, which is Bellflower, which actually happens to be one of the next suburbs to be established as well. And a lot of these cities were, to explain, a lot of these cities were very much organized and zoned in very specific ways, in which it's not as much as how Redlands is, where if you live in a very specific area of Redlands, you might be able to walk to the grocery store or walk to specific places. It's very much organized to separate the residential and commercial areas. But what we really see is that these suburbs, which are not only a response to growing families after World War II, but it's also a response to growing black families after World War II, and growing families that are starting to succeed and reap the benefits of the Great Migration as well. Because the Great Migration is still taking place all the way from 1910 to really all the way up to the mid to late 70s as well. So the Great Migration really is the backdrop of the mid-century architectural movement for a lot of different reasons. But what we really also see, and what we also have to take note of, is, is that these styles also, as I was speaking to before, as much as mid-century is more of an umbrella term, we also do have to realize that there is a difference between mid-century modern, there's a difference between the ranch style, there's a difference between multiple regional versions or regional variations of the mid-century style, ranch style, or mid-century modern style. So I want to make that those differences very clear as I can. So the ranch style of home, which is a mid-century style of home, ranch style homes are very much, rarely or ever, 2 stories. Ranch styles are usually only 1 story. And ranch styles are, like I said, are 1 story. They're very long in terms of how they're built out. So what I mean by long exactly is that there's not very much, if you were to look at it straightforward, the building itself or the entire house looks very long in stature, I guess you could say. And these ranch styles are, like I said before, usually put on very large plots of land. These are your styles, or your homes built after the 50s that have very large backyards, have very large front yards as well, and also typically have a garage or sort of driveway as well. And these styles of homes, like I said, are really the number one style. They're very popular in California, but they're very also popular, as per the name ranch, very popular in Texas as well as the Midwest, especially the plains. And these styles of homes are really probably the most reminiscent or significant in terms of the establishment of the suburbs and the establishment of suburban areas. Mid-century modern is kind of, like I said, it's still very much involved within the suburbanization of the United States, but it's within itself, it's stylistically different from the ranch style. So mid-century modern styles are more likely to have more than one floor. They more draw upon the natural environment or more draw upon the natural resources in the area. So ranch styles across the country look very similar, even if it's like, for example, a ranch style home in California looks very similar to a ranch style home in Texas, because they typically use the same materials. A lot of stucco is being used, or a lot of concrete is being used. However, mid-century modern typically uses lumber and stone and other natural materials that are more specific to that area. As well as brick specifics to the area as well. So mid-century modern, the philosophy around mid-century modern is more of a kind of, it is an, how should I say exactly? It's a philosophy that tries to make, instead of the previous philosophy in which was really heavy amongst traditional European architectural styles of the house dominating the environment around it, it's basically that the house conforms to the area around it and mid-century modern architecture. So when we talk about homes like falling water and things like that, the intention is to make the house feel as if it blends in with their nature around it by using resources and materials and shapes that are very similar to the area or environment that is around it. And then we also have, it's not really included into mid-century because the prairie style, or in some cases what people call the Chicago school style, is very stylistically different, at least at face value, from what we consider other mid-century styles. But the prairie school style really is, like I said, it's really a regional variant that's more persistent or more prominent in the middle of the country, specifically the plains, the prairies, and really more of the Midwest, which is more original, or it's kind of a more modern adaptation of the four-square style, which is also a more European styled home. But what we really see is that, specifically to kind of describe, if I were to describe this exactly, because there's more of a need for there's more of a need for other, more homes to fill out these suburbs that are being built. What we see is that we see more of the ranch style being adopted, as opposed to more specific mid-century modern style. However, the mid-century modern style really persists in the interiors of a lot of these ranch homes, but that's not really exactly the case. But what you might have noticed is that we're really talking more about residential architecture, which is what we start out with. And I really kind of talked about how, yes, there is definitely Black history involved within the residential architecture when it comes to the mid-century movement, because obviously this is not only an expansion of all Americans within the middle class as well as the suburbs, but there's really a specific expansion of Black Americans when it comes to the middle class and the suburbs what sees the mid-century movement really start to, I guess, become more popularized within the country. However, what we really have to bring attention to when it comes to specific architects is actually the mid-century movement as it pertains to commercial architecture as well as public architecture, and Black architects as well. And I was really talking about how the mid-century movement was very popular and very prominent, specifically in Chicago, as well as what we know as the DMV, that kind of triangle area. However, when we talk about mid-century modern architecture specifically, we think of Gully architecture as well. We think about the 60s style architecture of California, specifically California bowling alleys, eateries, diners, etc. And that architectural movement was also heavily inspired by and led by Black Americans in the country as well. And what we really see is it pertains to residential buildings, but it really pertains specifically to commercial buildings as well. And what we're seeing is that California specifically, and this is why I'm talking really about California, is that California really has an explosion of population due to, one, the Great Migration, but also just a migration of not more than just Black people to California. But it has an explosion of population because of, one, the film industry, and two, the just an overall migration from multiple different groups to California, specifically Southern California. So what we see in Southern California is the establishment of multiple different suburbs. I talked about how Lakewood, California was essentially one of the first established suburbs within the country. And alongside Lakewood, California, now to kind of give you an image if you don't know this area is Lakewood, California, Southern California. These are suburbs outside of Los Angeles. So this is what we call South Bay, LA, or South Bay, California. So this is around Los Angeles, California. So I'm talking about suburbs and or cities such as Lakewood, California, Downey, California, Bellflower, California, Norwalk, Cerritos, things like that. These are all cities that are being established in the 1960s. These are all cities that were previously either farmland or just open or empty lands that were being rapidly developed as suburbs. And also at the same time, despite LA being almost more than 100 years old at this point, we're also seeing a kind of transformation or the building of multiple buildings in the city of Los Angeles within this mid-century style, especially to accompany and especially to really meet the needs of this not really burgeoning, because Hollywood had already become really a place known for actors and actresses and people in the film industry as far back as the 20s. But what we really see in the 50s, especially the 60s, is that the industry grows even further. As the golden age of Hollywood in the 20s, yes, there were a significant amount of people in the area. However, after the golden age ended, there was kind of a revival happening in the 50s and 60s, especially not when it comes to movies, but also when it comes to television. Specifically because with the advent of the television, by the 60s, well, there was a radical difference in terms of how many people had a television in the 50s and the 60s. It basically not only doubled, but it not only tripled, but it probably, in my research, it more than multiplied by 5. In most cases, by the 50s, not many households had a television. Most households were receiving their news via entertainment via newspapers or radio. But by the 60s, it was much more common for a household to have a television. And by the 70s, it was also not only was it much more common for a household to have a television, but it was much more common for a household to have a color television. And the reason why I mention this is not in the 20s, you only had people living in, Hollywood because of movies. But now in the 60s, all the way from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, now you have people living in Hollywood, not just the actors and actresses, but the cast, but also the crew as well. They're living in Hollywood not only to produce movies, but also to produce television shows. So what we also see is we see other residential styles really to start to really become popular in the area. So it isn't just the ranch style, but we also see a lot of different apartment styles, specifically in Los Angeles and also the Valley. We see what is known as the dingbat apartment, which the dingbat apartment is basically, if you've ever seen it, you probably are very familiar with it when I describe it to you, is an apartment in which it's usually more than one floor. It has to be more than one floor architecturally, actually, in which you park your car under your apartment, and that apartment is your apartment is on the second floor, and that apartment is held up by usually columns, and it gives the appearance that your apartment is floating over your parking spot. I probably did not explain that in the best way, but you're probably familiar with that as I describe it. And what we see is because of the need, not just for suburbs, but the need for apartments for people in the film industry who are traveling, who are, doing work in other countries or other states for whether it be television or film, there was not only a need for more permanent homes, but there were a need for apartments. So those apartments were built not in the style of, the golden age of Hollywood or the 20s in Los Angeles, but in the 60s, 70s, and 50s and even 80s style of mid-century. And what we really see is that there is a need to cover all different types of architectural needs, like I said before, whether it be, a suburb where you have a mom, dad, and 2.5 children, those 2.5 children being a daughter, son, and dog, or, the single director or the single key grip who's producing films in Hollywood but has to travel to, say, Atlanta to get a shot or something like that. So that's what really is, that's what we really see within, especially California. And California really is one of the mid-century style really is all over the country, but California is really one of the cities that has the most of the style, but continues to preserve the style. I was talking about suburbs and or cities I lived very close to in my childhood. Downey, which is also one of the cities that borders Bellflower, California, has a preservation association specifically to preserving 60s through 80s architecture, well, actually technically 50s through 80s architecture. Now, when we think of preservation groups, especially in Redlands, we're thinking of, homes that were built in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. But in places like Downey, in places like Bellflower, in cases like Lakewood, it's the preservation of buildings that were built in the 1950s to the 1980s, because this was the beginning of a lot of these cities, especially in California. But going back to what I was saying before, it wasn't just residential styles as well, it was commercial styles. And the reason why I bring up California is not just from a residential sense, but because of the amount of people moving to California, other infrastructural needs became a real, not problem, but became a real need in California at the time. So one of the things that we also, when we think of mid-century modern marvels or mid-century modern architectural marvels, is we really think of LAX or the Los Angeles International Airport. And why we think about it is actually what we're kind of saying the star of our show today is, or the star of our lesson today is really someone who was instrumental in not only the mid-century modern movement, but also the building of the Los Angeles International Airport as well. And we're talking specifically about Paul R. Williams. Now, Paul R. Williams was a Black architect, specifically in California. And the reason why I mentioned the film industry is that Paul R. Williams not only was responsible for a lot of the buildings and a lot of the style of that kind of mid-century style of the Los Angeles International Airport, but also was responsible for a lot of the homes of famous Hollywood stars. And when I say that, I specifically want to cite, I specifically want to cite that not only was he famous for the building of residential homes, but he was more also famous for some, like I said, public infrastructure as well. So Paul R. Williams was responsible for, well, he was both born and died in Los Angeles. He essentially continued his education at USC, which was not very common. He was born in 1994, and USC, although was not segregated, it was not very common due to other obstacles during the time. Was not very common to see people studying architecture or studying in general at USC. And in fact, he was technically the first licensed black architect in California. Of course, there were other architects before him, but licensing in architecture, of course, makes it much easier for you to be an architect in the first place. And he really established, in not just my opinion, but the opinion of most of many of us, the look of Southern California and Los Angeles in the 60s. If it wasn't something that was built in the 1910s before the 1950s, then more than likely Paul Williams either designed it or built it. And the reason why I also mention this is we have to remember that there are cities specifically that that we have to realize that there are cities in the suburbs of California that we say that have some of the largest populations of Black people in the state, specifically Carson, California, and that's why what we really see is that not only was he responsible for a lot of the architectural stylings in residential areas, but he was also responsible for, like I said before, at LAX, what's called the theme building. He was responsible for the design and architecture of that. He was responsible for the La Concha Motel. He was responsible for Hollywood star Jay Paley's house, the Beverly Hills Hotel, and he was also responsible for another Second Baptist Church, not the Village SBC as we now know it, but he was responsible for the oldest Black Baptist church west of the Mississippi River, being the Second Baptist Church of Los Angeles. And a lot of these styles, like I said before, a lot of these architects specifically, not only Paul R. Williams, but a lot of Black architects are not only responsible for the look of residential and commercial buildings, but a lot of these architects got their start in designing churches. And we'll talk about the design of the Village Second Baptist Church, but a lot of these churches, whether they be AME churches, or Baptist churches, were designed by people within their own communities, by architects who are based in these communities. And there's actually a group, I'm really blanking on the name of it, but there's a group that is actively looking to preserve these churches and actively looking to preserve and really continue the legacy of these churches, because a lot of famous architects, whether they be Los Angeles or whether they be all across the country, a lot of famous Black architects were responsible for the building of these historic churches. And it's very important that we continue to preserve them, because it's essentially their legacy, because these buildings typically were the first buildings that they were contracted to design or contracted to build in the first place. But when it comes to the mid-century movement, we really have to put credit on not just the designing of churches, but the designing of apartments, hotels, and homes on Paul R. Williams, as he is essentially the person. When we think of California, when we think of LA, if we're not thinking about 20s LA, we're not thinking of older LA, but we're thinking of mid-century LA, we think of Paul Williams, and for a very specific reason, because he nearly designed and or set the pace and or tone for the area in the first place. But what we also have to take note of as well is that the mid-century style was not the first time that Black Americans or Black people in the United States started to become familiar with or became architects. Just because Paul Williams was the first licensed architect in California in the early 1900s does not mean he was the only Black architect to exist in California or was the only Black architect to exist in the country. Of course, there were architects who did not prefer the licensure system, and there were also architects who were licensed but were just in other states in the country. But when we think of it, besides the mid-century movement, we can also argue that the building of churches, and of course a lot of these churches were built during the mid-century movement, but also other churches were not as even our own church in the village, Second Baptist Church, was not built during the mid-century movement, but probably the most significant architectural contributions by the African American community are the building of a lot of these churches. And a lot of these churches were based on the architectural styles of their era or their area. Um, but what we have to take notice of is why or how exactly or what these styles are. Now, to kind of use our own church as our example, um, the village is not, or the building that the village is not a mid-century modern style building. Of course, it can't. It in no way stylistically, in no way chronologically, it is. It was not built during the middle of the century. It was not. How should I say? Sorry. And it was not built in the style of what we now know as mid-century or mid-century modern architecture. If anything, is more similar to a Spanish colonial or mission style architecture, more persistent to the 1920s and 30s. And of course, that is the style just based on the appearance as well as the time it was built, as well as the area it was built. Because if something was being built in California in the 20s or 30s, it was within a couple of different styles. It was either within Art Deco, which was the modern style at the time. It was either, like I said, the colonial style, specifically Spanish colonial, especially in California, or it was built in kind of the English style of either English arts and crafts, Tudor, or Queen Anne Victorian. So what we really see is that a lot of the architectural styles and a lot of the architectural movements within the country by Black Americans either came out of that mid-century movement or come out of the need for churches in their respective communities. And what we really see is a lot of people, I don't know how to describe this exactly, but there is a architectural difference between a lot of the churches that were established and built in Black communities compared to some of the churches that were built in white communities. And it's for a couple of different reasons, I would say. More, as we know, most Black people in the United States tend to be Protestant. And if you may or may not know, there is an architectural difference between Catholic churches and Protestant churches. And because of that, because the majority of Black people in the country are practicing Protestants, there was an architectural difference. And typically what we see is Catholic churches are built to be, and this is kind of very similar to the mid-century, or actually not similar, but almost opposite of the mid-century style of thinking. Catholic churches are built to be dominant over the land it is built. It is built to be, in a way, awe-inspiring, and it's built to not blend in a way, if that makes sense. So when we think of Catholic churches, we think of the Notre Dame Cathedral. These are very tall, very sizable churches. And of course, there are large Protestant churches as well. But when we think of these churches are intentionally built and intentionally designed to be awe-inspiring and to be, to stand out from its surroundings. Protestant churches, especially in the 1900s, especially in the 60s as well, especially during the mid-century movement, are like most residential buildings and most buildings within the style of the mid-century modern movement specifically, were built to blend in with surroundings. Were built to use the materials around in the area, to use the stones, the timber, and even in some cases the bricks, and in some cases the stucco that was specific to that area. And what we see is that Black churches, when they were built, are even, like I said before, are more reminiscent of the area, or more reminiscent of the natural resources of the area. So whether they be churches such as the Village that were built in the 1920s, as we see it with the Village, we see a Spanish colonial style that was heavily influenced by Pueblo style and indigenous styles of building. But we also see a building that is comprised of the natural resources, specifically the lumber of the area. But we also see when it comes to mid-century churches as well, to that we see that these churches are using typically stones. We see that these churches are using a lot of exposed lumber or a lot of exposed timber as well, as opposed to brick. And of course, some of these churches would use brick as well, but there was more of an emphasis on stones and wood in this case. But a lot of these churches are, especially in the 60s, are even more, I guess you could say, more likely to blend in with the surroundings of the area. And when it comes to the architecture and the architectural styles of mid-century modern architecture, to kind of close out, I would definitely say that mid-century modern architecture is it not, like I said before, it's not only a response to the need for suburbs, and in the case of Black American suburbs, due to the Great Migration, but it's also this breaking away of traditional architectural styles that had been present with previous architectural styles that were influenced by European styles. So what the mid-century modern architectural style really said, whether it be through the entirety of America or specifically through Black communities, was that it was going to adopt the materials and the needs of that specific area. Now, I'm not saying that every single style or every single building before the mid-century style was completely not acknowledging of what of the materials of the area, because that's not exactly the truth. However, what I'm saying was that a lot of these mid-century modern styles specifically use a lot of the materials that were in the area already. And the mid-century movement as a whole was more representative of the need for more housing, whether it be single-family homes or multiple-style family homes in the form of apartments, especially in Los Angeles. So what I really would say is, and also in the case of commercial-style buildings, it was, especially for Black artists, because Black artists had been given so many obstacles to becoming licensed architects, what I really noticed when it comes to the mid-century style was that a lot of Black artists, but also just architects in general, wanted to leave their mark by creating something unique, something that wasn't as uniform as the styles of the past. Because when we think of, these Victorian buildings, of course, are very beautiful buildings, but these are buildings that we have been seeing for almost 300 years on end. And what the mid-century modern style was, it was basically a time for a lot of architects to say, hey, this is a new era, not only for architects as a whole, but a new era for the United States, and we're going to essentially create a style from the ground up. And that's why I say the mid-century modern style, yes, it is all over the world. However, for the United States, it was a unique attempt to essentially create a style from the ground up, and to create a style that, yes, had European influences, but was drawn from influences of other communities in the area. Because not only does it have African and African American influences, but the mid-century modern style also drew from Northern/Scandinavian influences. It also draws heavily from Mexican architecture as well. And it also, in some cases, draws heavily from the rest of Latin America and South America as well. So what I really say is that the mid-century modern style is significant to Black history, in this case, is because not only was it a way to show, it was a time in which more Black people were getting into the professions, and in the case of Paul R. Williams, were starting to become licensed, and were actually starting to actually be able to put their buildings out into the public rather than residential spaces specific to Black communities. But it was specifically a time in which a lot of these styles or a lot of these buildings were not just reminiscent of European styles or European immigrants or European descendants or European ancestors. It was starting to represent more of what the fabric of America actually is, rather than just one piece of that fabric. So the way that I think of, as much as I do like those styles of architecture, the way I think of more traditional styles of architecture in the context of America is that it really it's only one part of America. It's only one ingredient. But the mid-century style is more of that salad that we kind of talked about, where it starts to accompany other parts. It's not just the lettuce, it's the, and I don't know what salad I'm thinking of now, but let's just say like, fruit, nuts, whatever you want to think of. So what we're seeing is the mid-century style is really the beginning of a lot of the style of Black architects starting to become more present in within the American eye, besides Black Americans' own neighborhoods. So as we kind of close out, we're going to close out a little early. I think what we have to think of yes, there were Black architects before the mid-century. During this time, there were Black architects who existed before 1800, and there were Black architects who existed after 1800, and there were Black architects who existed before mid-century, and there were Black architects who existed after the mid-century. But what we have to realize is a lot of these architects were not given the opportunity to, or were given harder opportunities to become architects who could put their names on public buildings, or who could put their names on buildings that were accessible to all communities. So once, things like the Voting Rights Act were passed, or once, segregation was not as legally enforceable, it became much more possible, and it became much more probable that we see styles such as mid-century modern architecture, which is heavily influenced by the work of Black architects, specifically Paul R. Williams, become more present in society. And as we close here, like I said before, we're just going to kind of close out here and just kind of remember how use this, especially if you're watching this video afterwards, really you have on your mind the history of the Great Migration, and how the Great Migration, like I said, is exactly the backdrop of what we see within the mid-century modern architectural style and movement within this part of history from the 1950s, to all the way up to the 1980s. All right, thank you so much.